I'm Larry Hinsman. I'm the director of the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and it's my pleasure and honor today to introduce Senator Murkowski. Senator Lisa Murkowski is the first Alaska-born senator to serve our state and only the sixth United States senator from Alaska. Lisa Murkowski is a third-generation Alaskan, born in Ketchikan and raised in towns across the state, including Wrangell, Juneau, Fairbanks, and Anchorage. She's only the 33rd female to serve in the U.S. Senate since its founding in 1789. Senator Murkowski has assumed leadership roles quickly in the Senate. She is the senior Republican member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee and also serves on the Senate Appropriations Committee. Senator Murkowski is a member of the Senate Health and Education, Labor and Pensions Committee and is also a member of the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. Senator Murkowski earned a BA in economics from Georgetown University in 1980 and then returned to Juneau to work as a legislative aide. In 1985, she graduated with a law degree from Willamette University and became a member of the Alaska Bar Association in 1987. She served as Anchorage District Court Attorney for 2 years and then worked in Alaska commercial law for 8 years before opening her own practice. Senator Murkowski was elected to 3 terms in the Alaska State House of Representatives beginning in 1998 and was named Alaska House Majority Leader during the 2003 and 2004 term. After being appointed to the Senate in December 2002, Senator Murkowski was elected to full 6-year Senate term membership in November of 2004. Senator Murkowski has always been strongly concerned about the science and policy of climate change, particularly issues related to warming in the Arctic and impacts on Arctic residents. She is a leading voice on Arctic issues in the U.S. Congress and has been working on them since she arrived in the Senate nearly 8 years ago. She was the only member of Congress to be involved in the development of the U.S. Arctic policy, and as a member of the Appropriations Committee, she has supported extending continental shelf mapping, Arctic research, and refurbishing the Polar Star. She also secured the funds to study and design our new ice-strengthened Arctic region research vessel. Senator Murkowski has always been a very good friend to the scientific community, providing strong support to NSF, NOAA, and DOE. She has promoted international collaborations through her membership on Foreign Relations Committee. She has also served as a chair of the East Asia Subcommittee and helped promote strong partnerships between U.S. and the Asian research communities. In August of 2008, Senator Murkowski convened the 8th meeting of the Conference of Parliamentarians of the Arctic region in Fairbanks, Alaska. The Arctic Parliamentarians is comprised of the delegates appointed by the national governments of the Arctic states, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the U.S., and the European Parliament. Senator Murkowski is also a strong advocate of ratifying the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is set to receive attention in Congress this summer. I've had many conversations with the Senator over the last few years, and I've been continually impressed with her knowledge and understanding of the science of climate change. She is incredibly well informed. John Walsh and I were invited to visit her office to discuss the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment following its publication in 2005, and I believe she's probably one of the few people in the entire room who's actually read the book in its entirety. So I thank Senator Murkowski for your strong support of research community, and thank you for taking your time from your very busy schedule to join us today. And I ask my colleagues to welcome you to this conference.
Larry, thank you. Thank you, Larry. Appreciate the invitation and to be here today to speak to you at the State of the Arctic Conference. As you walk through the hotel, though, you have to just kind of do a little bit of a double take. We're here at the State of the Arctic, we're here in Miami. The question should be, why aren't you in Fairbanks? Well, I think we know the reason why we're not in Fairbanks. It's still cold and still really wintry there, so this is a great place to be, but we also recognize that from the international perspective, this is really a great location for a conversation, a dialogue about an issue that has not only taken over my state of Alaska, but the country in many regards, and certainly the corners of the globe when we talk about the issues of climate change and the impact. Now, I've had an opportunity to look through the agenda that you have been involved with for the past 3 days, and I have to tell you, from a policymaker's perspective, it's somewhat intimidating coming in to a conference with the just the level of academia that you see reflected in the speakers, just the level of detail that you have been exposed to and had an opportunity to participate in. So I'm honored to be here today to speak to you. My real challenge is going to be to avoid repeating what you may have heard just generally. So rather than trying to compete and talk about what we're seeing with the science, I'm leaving that to the experts, and we'll have a conversation here this afternoon about some of the policy issues, some of the governance issues. You all have been focused on the environmental issues, the environmental changes that the Arctic is encountering right now. We know that the Arctic is warming at a faster rate than any other area on the planet. Some of the sea ice models are now projecting the Arctic Ocean can be seasonally free of ice within a decade or two. And again, I don't want to speak to the science of it. I do want to acknowledge, though, the incredible work that came with the International Polar Year. Every 100 and, well, excuse me, it's not every 125 years, it's every 50 years. We have incredible, great minds across the world coming together, focused on scientific and exploration programs. The Polar Year between 2007, 2009, one of the largest collaborative scientific endeavors in history, with over 200 projects involving 50,000 people from over 60 nations. I think we recognize that this incredible effort only stands to dramatically increase our knowledge of the Arctic, and hopefully will be a lasting legacy of Arctic research. It was certainly one of the most comprehensive multinational efforts that we have seen. And I had the honor to be a participant when we kicked off IPY in the United States Congress. I was one of the co-hosts, and because of that, I have, as Larry has pointed out, I've been glued to so much of what has come out of that great research. I've watched the work, I've read the results of the projects. I've really been very, very encouraged by the prioritization of science within the Arctic region. Now, I mentioned that I want to touch on the policy side of the Arctic. I would like to tell you that the Arctic policy in this country enjoys the same level of priority that we're finally starting to see with the science in the Arctic. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. I've been working on Arctic issues since I came to the Senate 8 years ago, and I am constantly reminding other policymakers that we are an Arctic nation. We're an Arctic nation because of Alaska, so it's only one state, but we're an Arctic nation. And as such, we've got an obligation, and we've got certain responsibilities that come with it. As Larry mentioned in the introduction, I'm the U.S. representative to the Conference on the Parliamentarians of the Arctic Region. Just yesterday, we met in Washington, D.C. For our semi-annual meeting. We were discussing many of the issues probably that you have gone over these past several days. We're also talking about the upcoming meeting, which is going to be hosted by the European Parliament in Brussels in September. But we've had conversations over the years, my fellow Arctic parliamentarians, about, well, where is the United States when it comes to an Arctic policy? And I have to tell you that they're somewhat bemused by the fact that the United States just hasn't appeared to be engaged, really, on Arctic policy and Arctic issues. But we had a little bit of a breakthrough yesterday, and I'm pleased to report this. Not only was I there as the senator from Alaska speaking to the Arctic parliamentarians, but we had other colleagues join us and give their perspective on what we're seeing in the Arctic, what the role of Congress can be. We had Senator Kerry join us and speak about the climate change legislation that he's attempting to build out, spoke a little bit about the prospects for law of the sea, and we had a lunch that was hosted over the Department of Interior by Secretary Salazar. It's the first time we've really had kind of the blessing of an administration in our meetings. And the Secretary was really quite engaged and went around the room of the representatives and said, okay, tell me how, in your opinion, the United States can be a broader participant in the Arctic. And it was wonderful to hear. So there is a change that I feel from the policy perspective that is long, long, long overdue. We were involved, I was involved, my office was involved, as we worked with the Bush administration in developing an updated Arctic policy. Hadn't been updated in 14 years, and when you looked at the policy that was in place, it was nothing but just kind of generalities on a skeleton or a blueprint. There was no real substance to it. But that policy was advanced towards the end of the Bush administration, and that policy directive has been taken up by the Obama administration, and I think we're starting to see some good progress there, so I'm pleased. I think we recognize that the Arctic truly is the last frontier. It's one of the few places on Earth where the borders aren't clearly drawn on the map, and some of those that are drawn are disputed. It's changing rapidly. The impacts of this rapid warming in the Arctic are being felt dramatically by the residents, by the indigenous people who are legitimately concerned about the effects that an ice-diminished Arctic will have on their way of life. We know that so many of the indigenous peoples are still living a subsistence lifestyle, and as such, they're very dependent on the sea and the ice, and they fear not only the loss of summer ice and the effects on marine mammals, but the increased maritime activity relating to the transportation of goods and oil and gas, mineral extraction, tourism, research. They fear that these impacts could be very negative on them, and it is so important, it's absolutely critical that they be at the table, engaged in the debates about governance and about policy in the region in which they live. I've said several times, I think that we're at a very critical time for the Arctic right now. There seem to be two separate paths that we can take in regards to international relations. One is a path of competition and conflict, and the other path is one of cooperation and diplomacy. And I believe the decision on which path we ultimately take is going to require very dynamic and aggressive leadership. One of the first areas that we need that leadership is actually within the United States Senate with ratification of the Convention for the Law of the Sea Treaty. It is absolutely critical, in my opinion, that the United States be a party to this treaty, be a player in the process, rather than an outsider sitting out there hoping that our interests are not going to be damaged. Accession to the convention would give current and future administrations both enhanced credibility and leverage in calling upon other nations to meet convention responsibilities. And given the support of the treaty by the Arctic nations and the drive to develop their natural resources, the treaty will also provide the environmental framework to develop these resources while we minimize environmental impacts. It was interesting discussion yesterday at the parliamentarian conference, because individual after individual from the various countries who spoke said, we just can't understand. We look at the United States and we see that it is clearly in your best interest as a nation to be a member of the treaty, to ratify this. We just can't understand why you haven't done so. And then you have to kind of walk them through some of the politics that are at play. And of course, then it makes it clear as mud because you've got just about all the military. I'm sitting in a foreign relations hearing a couple years ago. There were more stars on shoulders than you could possibly imagine, sitting there in front of us, telling us that from a national security perspective, the United States must ratify this treaty. And witness after witness, and yet we are bogged down in our own process. I happen to believe that we have the votes within the Senate, the 67 votes required to ratify. Our problem is that our rules and our process within the Senate allow holds by individual senators. They allow, of course, for a filibuster to proceed, and there are certain members within the Senate that remain fearful of the U.S. being a participant, and they've held us back. But I think the time has long passed for us to move and move in a way within the Senate that finally allows us to be this participant at the table. Will it happen this summer? We are hopeful. Senator Kerry, as you know, is chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He and I have had many extended conversations about how we can push this forward to the calendar. And I believe that if we can get the support from the administration to make it a priority this summer, that it is possible that we will finally see this move. We recognize, and again, my friends at the conference yesterday reminded us, the United States is the only Arctic state that is not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention. It was first submitted to the United States Senate for approval in 1994. So we've been kicking it around there in the Senate since 1994. But until the U.S. accedes to the treaty, it can't submit its data regarding the extent of the continental shelf, or the extended continental shelf to the Commission. And without a Commission recommendation regarding this data, the legal foundation for the ECS limits is certainly much less certain than if we were party to that treaty. At the invitation of the Danish Minister for Foreign Affairs and the Premier of Greenland, representatives of the 5 coastal states bordering the Arctic, Canada, Denmark, Norway, the Russian Federation, and the United States, they met back in 2008 in Ilulissat, Greenland, to hold discussions. And it was at that meeting that they confirmed that the Law of the Sea Treaty provides the governance regime to manage the Arctic, and saw no need to develop a new comprehensive international legal regime for the Arctic, no new Arctic treaty. They also acknowledged their current cooperation with regards to protection of the marine environment, collection of scientific data, monitoring and research, and committed to working to strengthen this cooperation to include maritime navigation and ship pollution, search and rescue, again, all through greater sharing of information. Now, the 5 Arctic coastal states will again be meeting in Canada at the end of the month. They're going to be meeting on the 29th of March. I think this is very important. It is important to keep continued dialogue, talking about how to balance the economic development and protection of the environment, and again, also the collaboration and the sharing of the scientific research. Now, as I spoke of the 2 possible paths forward, I want to expand on that a minute. Well, some have described the scenario where the Arctic is undergoing this race for the resource, or some kind of an arms race. I am not convinced that this has to be the case. I do believe that there is some serious military posturing that is going on, especially between Canada and Russia, but whether or not that is actually translating into action remains to be seen. The Canadian government has taken a number of steps and statements to assert their sovereignty in the region, including the release of the Northern Strategy, planning of a military base in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, plans to build a fleet of ice-strengthened patrol boats, and also renaming the Northwest Passage the Canadian Northwest Passage. And then on the Russian side, they've shown some some increasingly assertive behavior regards to military and economic expansion there in the Arctic. The Russian Security Council has released details of how it will conduct its Arctic policy in a document entitled The Fundamentals of Russian State Policy in the Arctic up to 2020 and Beyond. I think it's important that we take a look and understand this document. It emphasizes the need to preserve the Arctic as a zone of peace and cooperation, which of course brings to mind the state of affairs in Antarctica, where the treaty system has guaranteed the continent's non-militarization, the dedication to science and research. Now, the Russian document also touches upon sustainable development and environmental conservation. And while the new strategy does reaffirm the determination of the country to establish a new military unit designed to protect the Arctic territory, both onshore and offshore, the policy is probably much broader than that. We know that there are national security and sovereignty issues for all the Arctic coastal states in the region, and most are putting their plans forth to increase their presence. Even the United States, in the Arctic region policy that I mentioned earlier that was released January of 2009, we've stated that national security is the #1 priority of the country in the region, the highest priority there. The United States Navy has a new roadmap for the Arctic. I've asked them to study the feasibility of a deep water port in the far north. This is going to be very important information for us. The Coast Guard has embarked on a high latitude study to determine what assets, what infrastructure they need to be prepared for a new ice-diminished Arctic Ocean. Now, it's not just those nations that have coastlines on the Arctic, as we all know. We're seeing other nations showing a very strong interest in the region. The Chinese already have one icebreaker, plan to build more, and as you know, they have a very active polar research program. The South Korean shipyards are now leading the world in construction of icebreakers, mostly of Finnish design, as well as ice-strengthened tankers and freighters. Both countries, along with Italy and the European Union, have applied for observer status in the Arctic Council. The EU, through the European Commission and the European Parliament, are gradually developing an Arctic policy to address EU interests in the region. NATO has also recognized that an ice-diminished Arctic has implications for accessibility and creates new security concerns and challenges. So, I mean, there's just so much that is happening out there. And I think we recognize that governance in the past few years within the Arctic has just simply become more complicated. When the Ilulissat Declaration reaffirmed the role of the 5 Arctic states as the primary guardians of the High North, they did not include the other permanent participants of the Arctic Council or the other non-Arctic states. And as you know, there were a number of concerns raised about their exclusion, and those concerns continue to be raised. And while conflict in the region may not be imminent, I think there are certainly many competing interests and views within the region. And that really leads us to a very fundamental question when we're discussing this, is who really are the major stakeholders in addressing issues of Arctic governance, and then what are their interests? The Arctic clearly offers a great opportunity for us to be working collaboratively and cooperatively. Secretary of State Clinton has confirmed that the Arctic is one area in which the Obama administration will highlight international cooperation in the implementation of U.S. foreign policies. And this follows the administration's intent to reset relations with Russia and the Arctic. And it really is a very good place to start. I have had some very good opportunities to discuss with Secretary Clinton while she has been secretary and when she was a member of the United States Senate, to talk to her about Arctic issues. And I will tell you, we're coming at politics from different sides of the aisle, but when it comes to an interest and a willingness to engage in Arctic issues, she is as good an ally as any Alaskan I've ever met on this. So we'll claim her on this issue. And I think it's very important to recognize that this, having somebody as your Secretary of State who has a focus in this area can be a huge opportunity for us in the areas of whether it's research or environment or maritime. She's an advocate there, and I really do give her great credit there. Now, one area that has been identified as an area of competition is in the extended continental shelf claims of the Arctic states. And while there's been a dramatic increase in mapping activity in the Arctic, it really has been an area of much agreement. Greenland and Canada have agreed on delimitation of the continental shelf between them, as Norway has with Iceland and Greenland on Jan Mayen Island. Of course, the United States and Canada have been working together the last 2 summers on extended continental shelf data collection in the Arctic. They're scheduled to be working again this summer. We've had the the icebreaker Healy up north that completed its 2nd summer of joint mapping with the Canadian icebreaker, the Louis Saint Laurent. And though each ship has their own equipment in order to accomplish the mission, combining their efforts has really provided much better data, and they can obviously cover much greater area together. Norway and Russia are also working together to jointly survey the Barents Sea area. So again, great areas of collaboration. I want to take just a little aside here, because as we talk about the mapping, it's absolutely clear and unequivocal. We've got to have the icebreaker capacity. All the information we are seeing is that yes, in fact, the ice is receding, and we're seeing more and more areas that are ice-free in the summer months. But this Arctic ice is not going to disappear. And we need the assets. We need the infrastructure. And that infrastructure, those assets, are icebreakers. I'm very pleased that after years of work, the Alaska Region Research Vessel, the Sikuliak, will give the scientific community yet another platform for performing science in ice-covered waters. We also worked very hard to get an appropriation to refurbish the Polar Star last year, and we funded the United States Coast Guard to do a study to determine whether we need to rebuild or replace our aging polar-class vessels. But really, no matter what the results of that study are, we absolutely must have the commitment from the administration and from Congress that icebreakers are a national priority. And I'm going to keep pushing on this, and we're making some headway, but it should not be this difficult. I know how much money it costs to build an icebreaker. We understand that. But if we are truly going to accept the responsibility and the obligation that being an Arctic nation means, then we've got to have the ability to perform the research. We've got to have the ability to allow for the level of commerce or search and rescue, and we simply must have the assets with the icebreakers themselves. The Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment recommended, of course, the development of a comprehensive multinational Arctic search and rescue instrument among the 8 Arctic nations. Again, an area where we're seeing very good, strong collaboration up there. There are discussions underway, a real desire for this recommendation regarding search and rescue, that this be one of the first efforts to implement the report, the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment report, to implement that. And that's going to be very good, very beneficial for us. So really then, what does the future hold for the Arctic? I think we recognize that the pace of change in the Arctic it simply demands that there be greater attention focused on the region, the implications of the dynamic, changing Arctic for the residents, and for the important U.S. security, economic, environmental, and political interests. They all depend on this. But is it going to be an area of multilateral cooperation like we see reflected within the scientific community, or is it going to be an area of conflict? I think clearly the Arctic region presents daunting challenges, but wonderfully unique opportunities relating to climate change, resource development, geopolitical transformation, and I am very, very hopeful and will work aggressively to ensure that it is a future of cooperation. But it will take robust diplomacy and very likely a recognition that interest in the Arctic is not just limited to the 5 coastal states of the Arctic or even the 8 countries who are permanent members of the Arctic Council. It will take a level of cooperation and of collaboration to involve all of the interested parties. And I believe that that is the road that we should be taking. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention, for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm hopeful that if you have any questions, we'll be able to address those. But again, thank you for your leadership in what I believe is one of the most pressing, fascinating, challenging, daunting, but overwhelmingly incredible issues that we can face, and that is our evolving Arctic. So thank you very much.